Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Maybe you've been listening for a while, or this is your first episode. If you like what you hear, would you do us a favor by rating and reviewing us on iTunes? This is a fantastic way to tell us you enjoy what we are creating. Also, if you want more MTSS resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter using the link in our show notes, and check out our website for all the blogs and guides you would ever need about MTSS. Implementing MTSS is often easier said than done. And today we're going to delve into the challenges schools face in adopting this essential framework, which is an overwhelming yet vital process for fostering student success. So, to guide us through this complex topic around implementation science, we'll be joined by Ellina Xiong, who is a leading expert in the field, and she'll share with us how that implementation science can serve as a strategic roadmap to simplify and streamline MTSS efforts, making this critical work more manageable and effective. So, Ellina, thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Larissa.
Welcome. And Ellina is our MTSS lead here at Branching Minds. And so we're so thankful that she could take a little bit of time of her day to join us. Ellina, I'm going to have you start out by just introducing yourself a little bit, give our listeners a little bit of background on your experience. And then I want you to share your favorite kind of cookie.
Okay. Well, thank you for that very nice intro. I think many people will argue against me being a leading expert in the field.
We're a leading expert in our field. Let's just say that.
But yeah, I've been doing this for a while and I love the work. I love systems work. I was really fortunate to go to the University of Minnesota for my graduate work. And at the time I was there, they just had a lot of leaders in the field actually around MTSS. And my training program was heavily focused on systems work. Even though I was going through as a school psychologist, it was heavily focused on systems work. So I got to walk into, my first day as a school psychologist already thinking about doing systems work and have done it ever since. I'm a school psychologist by training. Many people would say a recovering school psychologist. I also have my doctorate in special education. So living in that space of understanding the full continuum of student supports, right, from those who don't need a lot of support to those who need highly intensive support and individualized supports. In my last role, I was the assistant director of MTSS for the Washington State's Department of Education, or OSPI, as we would say in Washington State. But again, I've supported districts and school teams for over a decade now on implementing MTSS.
Wow, you have a lot of like varied experience, and I think that will just serve us well in this conversation. So I'm excited. Now, what is your favorite cookie?
My favorite cookie is a chocolate chip cookie, and in our house, we eat it year round. And we're kind of a little bit of snobs because once I learned how to bake cookies, we cannot eat chocolate chip cookies from the store anymore. Like, we just cannot.
I understand that. Like I love that you went with the classic chocolate chip cookie because I would probably say the same, but classic chocolate chip cookie, there's no replacing that.
There isn't. There is.
Well, I'm glad to get to know you a little bit, and I'm just going to kind of dive right in. So I mentioned this in the introduction, but implementation science is this term that we hear a lot, and I maybe want to just start out having you explain what it really means in kind of simple terms for those of us that work in education. How would you explain implementation science?
So it was a lot of really smart people who dug through the research to figure out what are those common things that these like successful companies or agencies or successful initiatives have that got them to where they want to be, right? Or got them to be successful. And so that's really what implementation science is. It's a collection of all of these research showing that if you do X, you have a high chance of being successful. And it really doesn't mean that you will be successful, right? Like it just says you have a high probability of being successful. So, what implementation science, as we in education know it to be, is that it's telling us these are the essentials that you need in order to set yourself up for success. And I want to stick with our cookie theme here because I often say this to teams when I'm working with them is that implementation science is like preheating your oven before you get ready to bake your cookie. And you have to preheat your oven so that you can set yourself up for success to actually get that chocolate chip cookie. So you have to make sure that the temperature is correct, right? Or that the stove is even turned on or the oven is turned on, right? And so that really is what implementation science is like you have to have these key things in order to help you be successful or get you on the right footing.
Yeah. So it's like having the conditions be correct. Is it conditions and processes is would you say of
Yeah,
implementation? Yeah.
you could say that setting up the conditions. Yep. Yep. So
Okay.
some of the things that often is associated with implementation science is making sure that you have a group of individuals who are going to lead the work, right? You can't just like hope that the work will happen, right? You have to really assign it to a group of individuals and they have to own that work and say, yes, we are going to take that on and we're going to lead it. So that's part of what implementation science will call out is like, you need that group of people who are going to do the work and it's part of what they do, right? It doesn't, when you think about like MTSS, they don't have to be called MTSS team, but it has to be built into their responsibilities that they will lead MTSS implementation. The other thing that implementation science will often call out is you have to have a way to train people to acquire the skills and knowledge to actually do the work, right? And so part of that is making sure that you have some kind of coaching infrastructure or coaching support system in place so that you can continue to build up staff skills and knowledge. And if you don't have that, then again you're asking a lot of people to just sink or swim.
Mhm. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So, like, I mean, many of the educators listening probably find that concept of implementation science overwhelming. So, what are the practical ways that we can take some of these ideas and apply them to supporting MTSS in schools? Maybe besides maybe the team or even having that that training available, the coaching available. But what are the ways that you think that we could help support MTSS in the schools in this process?
So how I think about it is there are lots of different ways to implement anything out there. And what implementation science offers is a structured process. So it's like if you don't know how to start or where to start, implementation science can give you that roadmap of, start here and work your way through it. And the nice thing, and sometimes something that people often forget, is that implementation happens in stages naturally, right? Like we learn things in stages, just like learning how to drive. You gotta take your driving course or read that little booklet, right? And that's like your learning phase, and then you get into the car and you start to get more comfortable with that car, and eventually you drive it without thinking about it, right? That's kind of how like implementation with anything is too, that it does happen in stages, and that there are certain milestones you need to meet before you move into that next stage so that you can be successful during each of those stages. And so the piece about implementation science, and again to make it more practical, is like we need to all agree on what are those milestones, and that sometimes is missed in the conversation because um, schools are moving so fast sometimes that not everybody gets on the same page, or not, or like teams sometimes don't take the time to sit down and say, okay, how are we defining this, what are we agreeing on? And as I said, like implementation science just provides a more structured process to do that. So they already, give us these different stages, they've lined up some milestones, and so now your role as an implementation team is to just see if you're checking off some of those boxes. Do we have this in place? Do we have this in place? Okay, we have these pieces. We can move into this next stage and feel really confident that we're going to be successful and keep moving on, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to meet everything in each of those different stages, but you should meet a majority of them, because a majority of them are really essential or really key to, again, helping you get off the ground and helping you to be successful.
Mm, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that idea of just like that it does naturally happen in stages. And I think that's because, many times we think we may want things to happen overnight and happen really quickly, but like naturally when it's people learning new skills, like it's going to be in stages. And actually, and I think if you want something to stick around, if you want it to be ingrained in the culture of the district, it should be in stages. It shouldn't happen so rapidly.
Yeah, the other reality is that, you know, um, these stages, they're not black and white. Like districts will ebb and flow through them, and they will ebb and flow depending on what they're working on. So when you think about MTSS, you know, often like, and every state has a different MTSS framework and calls out different components, and even some of the national organizations like AIR will call out different components. But one of those core components that's, or two of them that are very common, is database decision making and continuum of supports, right? So even when you're thinking about like database decision making, you can be in a different stage of implementation on how you're helping your staff learn about data, use data for planning and use data for decision making. And then when you look at like continuum of support, you might be in a different stage of reading implementation versus math implementation versus SEL implementation, right? And so you can be in different stages throughout your full MTSS framework. And I think sometimes we simplify it too much in terms of like thinking about, oh, for my district, for implementation science, for MTSS, we're in this installation phase, or we're in this initial implementation stage, right? And it's like, maybe generally, but if you dig deeper into the different components or the different practices, they may be in different stages. And again, sometimes you may be further along and then you end up moving backwards, right? Because there's a change in leadership and they want to go in a different direction, right? Or you have such high turnover that you lost so much skills and knowledge that you are training new staff, and so you do have to move backwards a little bit because you have to retrain everyone to help them, get up to speed. So there is a lot of ebb and flow in these different stages that implementation science calls out.
I think that you make a really good point of that, that sort of continuum of where you would be or the different stages and just how it can feel frustrating like on the educator side where it's like, "Oh, we've been in this stage for a while," knowing that there may be factors that, are out of the control of maybe some of the educators, right? Knowing that you have to catch everyone up to the speed or like change it. And I just feel like that is it's such an important point when we're talking about implementing something like MTSS is that, in order to move forward, some of these things stall out at different points and you have to sort of re-examine, okay, where are our milestones, are what are the factors that are preventing us from being there. So this kind of leads to my next question about what do you see as maybe some of the biggest barriers to implementing MTSS effectively, and how do you think educators and administrators work together to overcome them?
I think one of the greatest challenges that I've seen even in my work is like being willing to stick to a plan, or actually like starting off first with like writing a plan, right? Got to make sure that you have a plan, an implementation plan. You're calling out your milestones, you're calling out your priorities, you're calling out who is leading the work, right? It doesn't mean that there's not a team there, but there has to be a point person who's supporting with coordinating it, right? And helping to monitor its progress, right? And so the plan is really critical. And oftentimes, with school systems, they're just so they're first off, they are big systems, right? They're complex and they're very dynamic. They're one of the things I often feel like I say a lot, uh, and again, maybe others will disagree with me, is like there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen in schools, right? They just have a lot of groups that are invested in the success of those students, and not all of them agree with how to support students, right? And so with that, it's a very complex and dynamic system. But because it's a complex and dynamic system, you need to have a plan that spells out what is it that we're actually going to do, right? And who's going to do what part, so that we are, communicating this and we are moving this together, and then sticking with that plan, right? So the next piece is like to stick with it long enough that you can actually see things happening. We know from implementation science research that it could take 5 to 7 years to even get to full implementation, right? And that's sometimes in schools, like they just don't feel like they have that time
Mm.
to do that, especially with how funding is set up sometimes, right? You might just only have a 3-year grant, so you have to do this work in 3 years, right? Or you are leveraging a grant that comes in long term, or it's state funding that comes in long term. But even some of those funding streams have different rules that change, your practices, right? And so you have to change with it. But again, that's the key piece of having a plan, that if you have that plan in place, you know exactly what you're doing. So when those changes come in, you can tweak it just a little bit based on that change. Or if you another key piece is to collect data against that plan, to collect data to evaluate, is what we're doing working and helping students, right? And if you use that data, it will help to inform you how you may make other tweaks, right? Other small changes. But oftentimes, again, we are in an environment where like things are happening so fast, so often, and then there can be like an abandonment of the plan, and then you start over again or something, or a new team comes in and they start a new plan. But the essential or the really important piece is if you can have a plan in place and say, hey, we have this, we have these data that shows that what we're doing is successful. Like, let's keep going with it, let's keep moving with it, and then we can add on where it makes sense.
Yeah. I think abandonment of the plan, it made me think of like when 2 years into an implementation and it feels like the wheels are falling off. Like, it's so easy for, if their new leadership come in and say, "Oh, well, we'll just, like, abandon this plan." And if there's no one leading that effort, that's even easier for that plan to go out the window and everything to be reworked. But I think that that's essential in sort of in the beginning, like, as your plan, like, you kinda have to make a plan for your future selves, or even just for the future people that are continuing this work, to make it easy. I always think is like make a plan that's easier to stick to, too. You know, like don't be too lofty in your first, few years. I think that it's just interesting when you talk about this work, that because implementation processes, like, they really do feel complex and time consuming. What advice would you have to those school teams that are trying to simplify and streamline their approach to MTSS? How would you advise them to begin like laying out their plan?
I would say again, pick something that is concrete, right? Or again, when you're naming your milestones, name it in very concrete ways. So it's more manageable to say we're going to implement a coaching framework for our reading coaches, right? And then you pick that concrete thing and you spell out what are those practices that we want our coaches to be doing when they are going out to the schools to support teachers. What is the coaching model that we are going to use? And we're going to train our coaches in this, right? And science of reading is another, another term, if you will, that is really that is used broadly right now, and it can mean a lot of different things, right? It's the same thing with implementation science, right? But again, when you start to name these things of like this is how we are defining the science of reading in our district. This is how we are training our coaches, and this is how we want our coaches to go out and support our teachers, right? That's getting into those concrete practices helps you to be more successful in this so that you again and you have agreements, right? Everyone is on the same page. Or even if you're not on the same page, you can start to have a conversation to build consensus. So some things I've done in the past with even some of my teams is when we talk about tier one, and they're like, we have to have really good tier one practices. My next question is like, well, what are those? Do your staff know what they are? Do your leaders agree on what they are? So then as part of that work, we help them to identify what are your tier one non-negotiable instructional practices. If you went into a classroom, these are the practices that you want to see all the time. You want to see it, it could be, that teachers are always using the I do, we do, you do kind of framework, right, in all their lessons. And it could change from elementary to middle to high school. But again, there's agreements of like, these are the non negotiable practices that we want to see all the time. And if we don't get to that level of what are those concrete practices that we want to be seeing, or that students should be benefiting or students should be able to do, then it remains at that abstract level, and then everybody also gets to define it their own way,
Mhm.
right? And that's how we get to these spaces where you can be in a district and each school is implementing MTSS very differently. Or each school, let's just say, um, one of the things that should be black and white, but is not black and white, is like, how do students get tier two and tier three supports? Even those processes will vary from school to school, right? And so that is part of like what I mean when I say, try to get really wind down and narrow in on what are those concrete practices and have conversations around them and build consensus around them.
Yeah. I mean, I the phrase is echoing in my head as you're talking through this is like the clarity of those things is so helpful for the educator on the ground or the leader on the ground, because as if they don't have clarity around those practices, what are the concrete things that they should be looking for into, if a principal doesn't understand that, then it's like that the ambiguity is almost is more frustrating and more time consuming than anything else, because it's like they're answering the questions of, well, what is it that the district really expects of us to, in teaching reading, or, and so I always think that clarity is kindness. Bring clarity to those areas that are confusing. And it takes a lot of upfront work, right? Like it takes a lot of those conversations to happen even before, teachers set foot in the building for PD at the beginning of the year. It's like if year one you're implementing MTSS, there should be some things really laid out. What does that mean? What does that actually look like throughout the year, and having a plan in place. And I mean, and that's a lot of work, but it's like if the more work you can do up front, I think then it's easier to make adjustments to that plan and in the process rather than trying to make the plan as you go.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I've as an educator experienced what it feels like in a district where like I don't think anyone knows what they're doing. I don't think anyone knows the plan, what the plan is.
Yeah, and I think again we lean on the vagueness sometimes, right? Because if we're vague, then like we don't have to do that hard work of defining, right?
Mm,
Because the hard work is getting everybody on the same page and getting people to agree on it, which we know is really challenging, right? But it's like
yeah,
that's again the best way we can ensure that all all students are getting access to like the good stuff, right?
yeah.
Because then we're clear about what the good stuff are.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, some leaders are like, well, we don't want to micromanage how every school does everything, right?
Mhm,
And so sometimes they leave that vagueness of like, we'll leave it up to the schools. But sometimes I do think it's really important to be clear because if there are things that schools are held accountable for, like there should be clarity around that.
mhm,
Um, and because the idea is like, if we're trying to equitably distribute resources and provide what students need at every building, the district needs to set some of those foundational expectations or things as far as implementation because I'm thinking is like if you're thinking about how students receive tier 2 interventions, right? Sometimes that those are hard conversations because it depends on the school schedule and the personnel that a school has, and so sometimes that's a hard lengthy conversation you have to have with your building leaders to say, do we need to have some of those adjustments? And I think it's easier to be vague and leave it up to schools rather than have sometimes those hard conversations.
yeah, and I think again, going back to like implementation science, that's where sometimes implementation science can be really helpful, is to just help you go back and check. You can go back and just start to cross check, like, hey, do we have this in place? Do we have this? Are we doing this? Right? Because in my mind, I see, again, if you think about implementation science with the metaphor of baking. It is setting yourselves up for success. It's preheating that oven, right? And your cookie recipe, that's MTSS. That's going to be different for every school district out there. And I say that because MTSS is context specific. You cannot take what your neighboring school district is doing and just plop it right in your space because you may not have the same resources that they do. You may not have the same climate that they do. You may not have the same student population that they do. So, context matters. Your recipe will be very different from their recipe. And so, when you go back and you're trying to understand where are our challenges and how do we lift these barriers, using some of the implementation science tools can be helpful to just understand what pieces might we be missing that are essentials here to build our foundation, right? Is it that our coaching structure is missing? Is it that our communication plan is missing, right? Like, so you can just you can pick out those different pieces and then be able to build on your next steps from that, to know again what are those challenges and how do I identify how to address those such challenges using some implementation science tools.
Well, okay, so I would love to talk a little bit about how can we use implementation science to better measure the success of MTSS programs? And are there any like indicators or tools that you would recommend as people are doing this process?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Again, what I've seen in my work is people will often confuse implementation sciences tools with like MTSS fidelity tools, right? And I'm going to emphasize again, implementation science is really setting yourself up for success, making sure that you have the right conditions in place, the just some of the essential factors in place so that you can be successful in whatever you're doing. And it really can apply to anything. It does not only apply to MTSS, it can apply to, let's say, if you wanted to figure out how to build a car uh, or build a business, you could probably use implementation science to help you go through with it. So the tools I would recommend, especially at the district level, that if you're trying to figure out, do we have our infrastructure, meaning our roads and bridges of our district system to do this work well, I would use the district capacity assessment or the DCA to just figure out, do we have our roads and bridges for our system, right? And that can really help you to assess that, because that's going to look at, again, do you have a team that's designated to do this work? Do you have a communication plan? Do you have an implementation plan, right? It will look at those things. Now you're talking about MTSS fidelity, the implementation science tool I just said, the DCA. Item 13 on it starts to talk about fidelity. So that's where you bring in your different fidelity tools. PBIS has a fidelity tool, and that's what you would use to figure out, okay, if we were implementing PBIS in our district, how well are we implementing it based on best practices and based on how it was designed to be implemented, right? Item 13 on the DCA is where you will start to measure that. If you just want to know in general, how is our MTSS framework uh, doing? You can use, the Branching Minds self-assessment tool. We have that. AIR has one. The University of South Florida has one. So there are several MTSS fidelity tools that you can use out there. And so that's how you start to marry implementation science and MTSS. Is okay, again, implementation science is, do we have these conditions in place? And then MTSS is, are the best practices actually happening?
Well, I like that there are some tools to for people to utilize, because I think sometimes some of these things are talked about as in research, so it's really helpful. Like a concrete tool is great. So I would love to talk, just like the last question I want to ask is, so you have your MTSS, it's up and running. How do districts ensure, like, what are the practices that districts can do to ensure the fidelity and sustainability over time? And maybe what does implementation science play into that, maintaining that long-term success? I'm just curious, because we talk a lot about the beginning part of the MTSS implementation, but how do we do the work to sustain it?
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways where things get sustained, right? And sometimes in anything that we do, right? Like sometimes it's just tradition, right? You do something because it's tradition and that stayed with you. And sometimes you do something because, there's a new law that came through and now you've learned about that law and now you have to do it. All of this goes into like institutionalizing knowledge. So you have to find a process to institutionalize or to memorialize that knowledge so that it can continue on without you as like that individual that was maybe spearheading or steering the MTSS implementation efforts in your district. And so much of that comes down to what people would usually call a MTSS handbook. It's called a process guide in some place. It's called implementation guide in some place. But the goal of it is to put your practices, procedures, and processes on paper, on like in writing, right? In writing so that it outlives everyone who has worked on putting it in writing, right? But you put it in paper and it can be in all different formats. I've seen districts use a Google site to do it. I've seen districts use an intranet. I've seen people districts use a Google Doc, right? Like it can show up in different formats, but the goal of it is that you put your practices in writing and then it gets communicated broadly so that everyone knows this is how we practice um, you know this procedure, or this is how we implement X, and so that's that's one way of just institutionalizing that knowledge and training your staff on it, right? Like if we're going to have entrance and exit criteria for tier 2 and tier 3 supports, these are it. This is the flow chart that we use. These are the specific criteria or cut points that we use, or even things like, this is how you evaluate a healthy tier 1. You take step 1, 2, and 3, right? Like being able to spell out all of those things will help others to replicate that practice, right? And then if you communicate it broadly, then everybody is doing it, right? And so one of the key pieces, especially when I was supporting districts and evaluating their MTSS framework, is we looked at, are these practices, are the best practices being implemented, right? And then are they implemented consistently across the district, right? Because we don't want it to just only be happening in this corner. We really want it to be happening across the entire district, and it happening consistently across the entire district. And that's one reason why, when we think about um, defining your tier 1, and going back to what we said, right, making sure that there's concrete definitions and everybody agrees on what we're talking about. And so when we talk about like what is a healthy tier 1, what are the success criteria of a healthy tier 1, a common definition would be that you have a scope and sequence of your standards, right? That's a core piece, because that means that everyone, doesn't matter what school you're in, everyone follows that scope and sequence. And so that when a student goes from school A to school B, they don't miss anything, because everybody is following that scope and sequence. And so that's how you can ensure that there's consistency in instruction, but you can also ensure high quality instruction by again naming like what are these things that we
Mhm.
want to see in every classroom and in every school when we go in there.
Yeah. Well, and as you were talking, I was just even thinking about those districts that maybe build, MTSS into board policy and sort of do those kind of institutionalizing those things of like, this is how this school district does this, and so I think that those kinds of efforts are really helpful, and I love that you talked about the handbook, the MTSS. We've talked about that on the podcast before about how that is, like, so helpful to have a place where people can go and like this is what standard treatment protocol for reading intervention looks, all of that kind of thing is, if it's defined and it's clear for people, then you don't have the vagueness or the ambiguity for people to make decisions, because you want to enable your teams to make decisions without having to have that person there, right, all
Yes,
the time. You
yes.
want to enable them to do the process without it being about one person, and the best way to do that is through, like, a handbook and to
Oh,
have
yes.
that.
And I
Yeah.
think about, that teacher that gets hired in January, right? And they've missed out on all of those summer orientation and training that happens. And so much of that heavy training happens in the summer. And it's like if you're hired in the winter, like you have very little to go off of, right? So a handbook can really help you to get up to speed on what's going on, and it can also help you to know how does this district practice MTSS, right? How do they implement MTSS?
Mhm.
Because it is different. There are some really core best practices, but there are also some nuanced differences because of the different contexts that we're in, right? Like again,
Yeah.
I've been in a school where they implemented PBIS, but they were using the Ojibwe language to define some of their practices, and that's not going to be the same as another school that doesn't have any students who are speaking or learning the Ojibwe language, right? So it has to so again, the handbook is just like so critical to again institutionalizing that knowledge, but allowing people access to that. Right. One of the things
Mhm.
that this is probably like more than we need to talk about, but like one of my personal endeavors have been like, how do we break the cycle of gatekeeping knowledge? Right. Like
Mm.
how, because that is where so many people don't have an opportunity to do good practice is because they've not been given that knowledge and shown how to do it and shown how to do it well and shown how they can sustain it in the context that they're in. So how do we break that cycle of gatekeeping of all this knowledge and like really just share it out so that everyone can use it and everyone
Yeah.
can implement it well?
And not even like gatekeeping it, but making it accessible, making it just readily accessible to people. Because I often think they're like, well, that was in board policy. In my first 2, 3 years of teaching, I had no idea how to find board policy. Like, it's buried deep somewhere in the website and you have to know exactly where to look. And so I just think that making that easily accessible and not just accessible to find, but to read, to understand, to comprehend, I think is really important.
Yes,
So
and I think again, you are so spot on accessible because I think that's some of the hardest things about district training sometimes, right? Like when I worked in a district, right? If we got a training last year, all of that material only lived with me. I was the one that went to the training. It only lived with me. And so someone new can't access what we had last year. Like, where does that go? Right. And so
yeah.
again, a handbook just really allows you to like keep that knowledge um, um, like broad and accessible so everyone can know like, okay, this is how I need to, let's just say an example like, oh, this is the data protocol I use when I'm looking at how to differentiate instruction for my students.
Elena, we could probably talk more about that. Maybe I'll have you back back on. We can talk about making MTSS knowledge accessible. But I just appreciate you kind of digging into this topic. There's so much more we could talk about with implementation science, but I really just wanted to break it down for the audience. So hopefully, if you're listening, we'll provide all of the resources that she shared about in our show notes. And as always, if you're a listener and you've got questions, let us know. We'll be glad to throw them to Elena. Maybe she'll be back and answer some more questions about for us. But thank you so much for being here. I just appreciate all of your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.